One of the funniest incidents in my life happened not on stage, but in the audience. It was in the mid-'80s, and I had gone to La Cage aux Folles, a drag nightclub in Los Angeles. It was a real show business crowd. Milton Berle was on my left with his wife, and other celebrities were there as well. The lights went down, and the music started for the pageant of drag queens. The first one to come out was dressed as Cher. The drag Cher paraded around and finally went off stage right. The next drag queen was dressed as Diana Ross, and right after that was a drag Liza Minnelli. That's the trinity for gay men, the ultimate divas, and all three of them were important in my life. I had first met Liza when I went with Cher to a party at Halston's. In 1979, I met her again. She was playing a few nights at Radio City Music Hall. I had no romantic aspirations, and I certainly didn't think of getting into Liza Minnelli's business. We became friends and would go to dinner occasionally. Liza, Judy Garland's daughter, had been a star of stage and screen for decades. Whenever we got together, our conversation would turn to music. Liza would ask about Kiss. She wanted me to explain to her how it had all happened, how we had gone from obscurity to worldwide fame. I explained that it wasn't just one person. It was a huge confluence of record labels and management. She said there was nothing Madonna had that she didn't have, except for the right songs. I basically told her the lay of the land as I saw it. The Ethel Merman style of singing, with a wide vibrato, was a thing of the past. It wasn't going to fly. The average teenage girl didn't know a thing about that world. If she was interested in letting go of her past and recreating Liza Minnelli, then I could help her out. I became her music business manager. I took her to Columbia Records and introduced her to Walter Yetnikoff. He gave us the green light right away. He didn't waste time looking at bottom lines or consulting with vice presidents. He was a classic mogul. A young A&R guy named Michael Goldstone came up with an idea to put Liza with the Pet Shop Boys and do a modern Euro disco album. I explained this to Liza and told her what it would require. As I got more and more involved in Liza's recording career, we were seen together. Some of the gossip magazines started reporting, "Kisstory captures Liza's heart," which wasn't the case at all. Liza and I had a totally professional relationship. I would meet with her at her apartment, and then we would meet at the Fifth Avenue penthouse where I lived. We talked endlessly about movies, music, and her aspirations to break into the pop field. I enjoyed her company. I enjoyed going to events with her, like the grand opening of the first Hard Rock Cafe. I respected her as an artist, and I wanted to help her with her career. But that was all I wanted. The single she cut with the Pet Shop Boys was a huge international record. In America it didn't sell, but it gave her something more important: momentum. At that time, Dean Martin had fallen out of a tour he had undertaken with Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra. Liza joined that show, and in the middle of it, she played 23 shows at Radio City Music Hall, straight. That must be some kind of record. 6,500 people for 3 weeks straight. I wasn't the only one who liked Frank Sinatra. When I started working with Liza, Peter Criss kept telling me how much he loved him. I contacted his road manager, who got me front row tickets to see Sinatra in Los Angeles. Sinatra looked at us and winked. Peter was in heaven. He had just gotten the Good Housekeeping seal of approval from the chairman of the board. Liza had her ups and downs in life. Just as I was starting my own record company, Simmons Records, she and I decided to part ways. She wanted to go back full into the high-stepping and belting tradition of singing. I wasn't in favor of it. I thought people would think she was just putting on a mask as a modern pop singer. She couldn't break free of Broadway. To some people, that may have been important stuff. To the record-buying public, it meant nothing. In the end, we couldn't make it work. I met with Mickey Rudin, one of the top lawyers in the entertainment business, and we dissolved our agreement. Around the same time Liza left my life, Neil Bogart, the president of our label, and the man who had helped us so much in our early years, who had supported us as we rocketed to fame, was stricken with cancer. One night, I went to a music industry charity event at the Hilton in New York City. I was sitting with Neil, who had become very puffy, and I was joking with him, telling him, "I love pastries too." I didn't realize he was sick. My heart sank when I realized later on that the physical changes had to do with the illness. A few years later, our business manager called and said, "Would you like to go to the funeral?" "What funeral?" "Well," he said, "Neil Bogart just passed away." We flew out to Los Angeles and stood there, numb, while everybody from Neil Diamond to Donna Summer delivered eulogies. He was clearly well loved by lots of people. Astonishingly, his son, Timothy Bogart, wrote a script I'm now producing for a movie. Life seems to go in circles. By 1983, Kiss had dropped Ace Frehley and then Vinnie Vincent. We had gone from the biggest band in the world to a band seemingly on its last legs. We ultimately brought in another guitarist, Mark St. John, for Animalize, but he lasted for only one record. He developed something called Rider's Syndrome, a hardening of the muscles in the hands. They blew up to the size of balloons, so obviously he couldn't play. The Rider's Syndrome had started to accelerate during the making of the record, and we were worried. But Mark insisted that it wouldn't affect him. We actually started a tour with him and played a smaller hall in Poughkeepsie, New York. It was clear from that show that his medical problem was significant and that he wasn't the right guitarist for Kiss. Paul and I decided to produce Animalize ourselves. After we finished the basic tracks and I finished my vocals, I told Paul I would trust him to finish the album. He wasn't pleased, but I had a film opportunity I didn't want to pass up, so Paul ended up doing the work. I had wanted to act in movies for a long time. It dated back to my earliest interests, which were oriented more towards science fiction and fantasy films than to music. Whenever I saw movies, I read the credits. On one film it said that the casting directors were a firm named Fenton and Feinberg. I called the operator and found out where Fenton and Feinberg were. I didn't even know their first names. I called them up and said, "Hi, I'm Gene Simmons from Kiss. Can I come in and talk with you?" "Sure," Mike Fenton said. We set a time, and I showed up for my appointment and immediately announced, "I'd like to be in movies." Just like that. I didn't see the point in wasting time with a big wind-up. Mike Fenton called Michael Crichton, the director, who was a novelist and a screenwriter, and who would go on to write Jurassic Park and Twister and to create ER, and within 30 seconds, they had offered me a job. Actually, I had to pass one small screen test. Michael Crichton turned to me and asked me to do something strange. "Look me in the eyes," he said, "and don't make any expression. Don't grimace. Don't contort your face. And without saying anything, convey with your look that you're going to tear our hearts out." I stared at him with murder in my heart, and it seemed to work. I got a co-starring part in Runaway starring Tom Selleck. I hadn't even read the script. I was told that I would be playing the villain. On the first day of the shoot in Vancouver, the part called for me to walk up and ring a doorbell and say a line. I was supposed to pretend I was a repairman coming to fix something. I was supposed to communicate a certain untrustworthiness and threat. I read my line, and then afterward Michael Crichton yelled, "Cut!" I walked over to Crichton and said, "Look, I really apologize. I'll do anything you want me to do. I'm so sorry I messed it up. What did I do wrong?" No, he said. "Let me explain something to you. In movies, if the director says cut and you move on to another scene, that means good. If I say let's do it again, that's bad." Movies had a completely different dynamic than rock and roll. It was like pulling teeth. You sit around for 16 hours a day. The only thing I could do was try to figure out which of the female extras I'd like to take home that night. There were always interesting-looking girls on the side, and I'd be flying in girls left and right from California. It was a busy time, and also an interesting time, because I met a whole new group of people and tried many new things. Kirstie Alley played my girlfriend. I got to stick a knife through her neck in the movie. That made me a real likable fellow. I tried coming on to the actress Cynthia Rhodes. That didn't work out. So I tried her sister. That didn't work out either. So I went for one of the extras on the set, a real knockout of a Canadian girl. That worked. If at first you don't succeed. When I was in Los Angeles on one occasion, I hooked up with Stan Brooks, who was working with the Goober Peters Film Company. I had first met him in 1981 during the Grotus experience. He introduced me to Jeff Loeb and Matt Weissman, and at the Beverly Hills Hotel, we came up with an idea that would eventually become Commando, a breakout film for Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was going to be a starring role for me, but when I showed the script to Michael Rackmill, who was the producer of Runaway, he dissuaded me. I believed him and I let it go. I later revisited the script with the intention of trying to have someone else take a look at it, but it was too late. Producer Joel Silver had bought it, and it was being made. That was the last time I would let someone else decide for me what worked and what didn't. In 1984, during the making of Runaway, I would have enough time off during weekends that I could fly into Los Angeles and run around to the parties. The best parties were at the Playboy Mansion, especially the Midsummer Night's Dream parties, which were big summer bashes with hundreds of girls in corsets and underwear and a select group of eligible bachelors. Guys were not allowed in unless they were dressed in pajamas, and girls had to wear as little as possible. The ratio was something like 400 girls to 100 guys. That's how Hugh Hefner liked his parties. At this point, Diana and I had adjusted our relationship. We were still together, but we had our freedom. Before the party, I told her that I was going up to the Playboy Mansion and that I was planning on flirting and having a good time. At the party, I spent some time, and made some time, with a few gorgeous women. And then I ran into Richard Perry, a record producer I knew who had produced everybody from Rod Stewart to the Pointer Sisters. Perry introduced me to a girl named Shannon Tweed and her sister Tracy Tweed. Both of them wore stiletto heels and corsets, and both of them were formidable, well over 6 feet tall. You can imagine the effect. I was devastated by Shannon in particular, and did everything to try to woo her. We talked for a while. At first she wasn't interested, but after a while she came back around to talk with me. Then she took me to the library, where a secret door behind a bookcase opened into a passage that led to a wine cellar below. She sat down on a table in there, and I remembered thinking this was clearly an invitation. But 5 minutes went by without any sex, and then 10 minutes. I remember just being lost in conversation with her. She came from Newfoundland in Canada, and I came from Israel. And we started talking about the strangeness of America and how we both felt like fish out of water. After that, we went upstairs, not having fully consummated our first meeting. On the way out, she gave me her number and said, "Call me." After meeting Shannon, I lost interest in the other new friends I had made that night, including Miss February. I went back to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and all that night and the next morning, I tried calling the number. She had given me a wrong number. A guy answered. He'd never heard of Shannon Tweed. I couldn't figure it out. Eventually, I decided that I had been taken for a ride. Then, as I was watching television in my single room at the hotel, I saw a photo being pushed under my door. I got up and looked at the photo. It was a black and white headshot of Shannon. Then I looked on the back, and there was a handwritten note. "I've never been so insulted," it said. "If you took my number, why didn't you call me? Next time be a man and don't start something you're not going to finish." It was that kind of letter. And on the bottom it said, "If you still have the guts, here's the phone number." The number was different from the number she had given me the day before, only 1 digit different, but that's enough. I called her up immediately and said, "I say what I mean and mean what I say, and you gave me the wrong number." "The wrong number?" she said. "Don't you think I know my own phone number?" "I'm just saying that the last number is different," I said. She was angry at first, and eventually she relented. I went over to see her and was overtaken with passion and lust. I thrust my hand under her sweater and then kissed her deeply. She didn't seem to mind, and we became acquainted very quickly. Soon after that, I called up Diana to tell her about Shannon. I didn't want her to hear about it from the tabloids. I explained to her that I had met this girl and wanted to spend some time with her and see how that relationship went. She wished me the best and told me she hoped I was happy. Diana has always had the grace and class that I wish all women had. About 3 weeks later, Diana and I spoke again. Right off, she asked, "Are you still with Shannon Tweed?" I said yes. I wasn't sure where the conversation was going. Then Diana dropped a bombshell. "You know," she said, "she's my sister-in-law." Unbeknownst to me, Shannon's sister, Tracy, had secretly married Diana Ross's brother, Chico. Soon enough, I moved into Shannon's Los Angeles apartment. She was everything I never knew I wanted in a girl. She had her own career. She had acted on television shows and starred in dozens of movies. She didn't seem to want anything from me, and she was drop-dead gorgeous. Although I didn't know it at the time, Shannon had just come out of a relationship with Hugh Hefner and had lived at the Playboy Mansion with him. She'd wanted a career, and he wanted her there, so she moved out. She had also graced the covers of Playboy a number of times, and her portrait hung, I'm sure, on many walls around the country. As soon as we met, I told her everything. I told her I never wanted to get married, to her or anyone else, ever. I told her I never wanted to have children. I told her I was afraid of commitments, of any kind, and that I wanted to be free to pursue my ambitions, whatever they may be, without having to check in with someone. She was okay with all of it. In fact, she said she wanted the same thing for herself. I was hooked. I told her my philosophy, that I'd found the whole idea of marriage and commitment to be faulty at best, and in my opinion, obsolete and impractical. A major thing wrong with marriage is that traditionally one of the two getting married is a man, and men aren't cut out for marriage. A second problem is that someone other than the one who gave birth to you, your mother, is going to dominate you. My mother stopped asking me where I was going, who I was seeing, and when I was coming home decades ago. I would be damned if I let anyone else ever have that right. Despite my posturings, I was scared. Shannon disarmed me because everything about her was so honest. There were no games, no hidden agendas. If that isn't enough, Shannon was and continues to be the most striking woman I've ever seen in my life. I wanted us to work. I also wanted to feel safe. I wanted everything. I wanted the goddess, and I didn't want to have to grow up just yet. So at first, I lived with her in her apartment. I didn't want to plant my roots too deeply. And by the end of the first year, I learned how to drive at the age of 34. I bought my first car, a Rolls-Royce, and decided to buy a place to live with Shannon. I bought a home on 2 acres in Beverly Hills and paid cash. Though I was falling for Shannon more deeply every day, I was still cautious. I had read too many horror stories of relationships turning ugly, lawyers, alimony, lawsuits. I wanted no part of it. I would rather live alone for the rest of my life than have anyone dominate me or in any way expect payment for having shared my bed. That seemed to be the way everyone else lived their lives. People got married, then they got divorced and hated each other. Statistically, marriage doesn't work. Divorce often happens within a few years of marriage, at a rate as high as 75% in some parts of the country. Men are miserable, women are miserable, and both are trapped. When a couple splits up, often the man has to pay his ex-wife 50% of what he makes, before taxes, which is lunacy. The highest tax rate around is 48%, and in return the government gives you the armed forces, free schools, Social Security, and nationwide infrastructure. Your ex-wife gives you a few years of companionship for her 50%. My mother gave me life, and she's not getting 50%. It seems to me to be a lose-lose proposition. When a man marries a woman, he promises to stay with her and support her until he's 6 feet under, and he's not supposed to be attracted to or be with another woman for the rest of his life, from his 20s, say, until his death. He takes this oath in front of God, his wife, and all assembled. Everyone lies about their ability to fulfill these promises, but they go through with it anyway, and when the marriage is over, a man had better be able to reach deep in his pockets. Who invented this system, the devil? Despite my strong feelings about marriage, I still wanted to make a relationship with Shannon work. To say my life changed drastically when I bought that Beverly Hills house is to put it mildly. I had never had a driver's license before. You don't need one in New York. Taxis are everywhere, and if you have a car, you need a lot of luck finding a space to park it in, and you never know if the car will be there the next morning. I had a tennis court in California, but I'd never played tennis. I had a swimming pool, and although I could swim, I never went swimming. Between tours, my sleeping habits changed. Where once I had a lot more in common with nocturnal creatures, now I had a beautiful 6-foot playmate to wake up next to, someone I wanted to bring breakfast in bed to, someone I cared about. My neighbor next door was Donna Mills. On the other side, Kate Jackson. A few doors down lived Cher. Later on, everyone sold and moved away. I stayed. I liked it. I felt I was home for the first time. This level of intimacy made me want to share everything with Shannon. I started talking about everything, about how I was straight, had never been drunk, and that I had chased a skirt or two in my day. I even told her about the photographs. I had always felt if I had been with a girl, I wanted a picture of the experience. I had had literally a few thousand liaisons and had taken photos of almost all the ladies. I told her she needed to know about me, no secrets. I remember putting all the pictures on the table and letting her go through them. She couldn't believe it. She didn't understand it. But most important, she wasn't judgmental. She's always been like that, as long as I can remember. I don't know much about Shannon's life until we started living together. I didn't read Playboy, although I had obviously seen the magazine at friends' homes. I wasn't aware until she showed me how many times she'd been on the cover and inside. Perhaps some men would have a problem with millions of others looking at nude photographs of the woman they were with. But I was actually proud of the fact. Nudity to me isn't an issue. Violence and drugs are. As far as I'm concerned, if everyone had more sex, there would be less violence. Shannon was the girl of my dreams. She kept getting more and more beautiful. She never asked me where I was going. She never asked me when I was coming back. When we were away from each other, I would call her every day without fail. Not because I had to, or because it was expected. That would never have worked for me. I did it because I wanted to. Trial by Fire. A Death in the Kiss Family. 1985 to 1993. The year 1985 saw us solidify Kiss, with the lineup consisting of Bruce Kulick, Eric Carr, Paul, and myself. We had another platinum seller with Asylum, and we were doing it all without makeup and without the original lineup. We'd had new business management who had taken over Bill Aucoin's duties from '82 on, and that relationship had run its course as well. We let them go and hired Larry Mazer as a consultant. We were hesitant to employ new managers. They wanted too much money. So for all intents and purposes, we were self-managed. At this time, Runaway came out, to generally favorable reviews, and I immediately got another movie offer. Wanted Dead or Alive was to be directed by Gary Sherman and would star Rutger Hauer. I was slated to play the villain. When I arrived on the set the first day of shooting, I was introduced to the crew and to Rutger. He came over, shook my hand, and right there in front of everyone took my face in his hands and kissed me full on the mouth. The crew laughed their heads off. I was stunned. I enjoyed working on the movie, but my film career was really starting to irritate Paul and management. They wondered if I wanted to stay in the band or go for an acting career. The answer was that I wanted it all, but that wasn't entirely fair to Paul, who was committed to Kiss full-time. I acted in another movie called Never Too Young to Die. This time I played two roles, one as a CIA agent and the other as his alter ego, a transvestite rock star named Ragnar. I wore stiletto heels and a bra with a corset attached. I wore women's makeup. I wore fishnet stockings. I looked like an evil painted woman. One day, after I had gotten into my full getup, I started to teeter my way onto the set. Along the way I passed the trucking crew, who promptly ripped me a new asshole. "Hey, Gene, looking good. Hey, what are you doing later, baby?" I hated it. During one of the scenes, I had to mouth an old Wayne County line. "It takes a man like me to be a woman like me." My backup band were real transvestites who gave me tips on how to be convincing. The movie also starred John Stamos and Vanity, who enjoyed flirting with me as much as I enjoyed flirting back. Then in 1986, I was offered a film called Red Surf. The cast included Dee Dee Pfeiffer, Michelle's sister, and George Clooney. I played a Vietnam vet who has had his fill of killing. At the end of the movie, I had to come and save everyone from certain death. I was getting accustomed to the movie business. I was living in California with Shannon, while the rest of the band was in New York. Eric was working out just great on drums, and the whole touring environment was stress-free for the first time now that Ace and Peter were no longer in the band. By 1987, Kiss had gone through a series of guitarists. We had brought in Bruce Kulick in '84. In an odd coincidence, Bruce was the brother of Bob Kulick, who had auditioned for Kiss in its inception. While Bruce lacked a personal style, he was quite accomplished and was willing to reproduce Ace's solos from the records. Bruce has always been a professional, and being in the band with him was a joy. Initially, he lacked a certain stage presence, but though he was sensitive about his shortcomings, he was willing to work to become a better stage performer. Paul was looking for other ways to express himself, including acting. He would later go on to star in the stage version of Phantom of the Opera and close the show after 150 performances in Toronto. Then he decided to put together a solo band, the Paul Stanley Band, and go out on his own tour. His band consisted of Bob Kulick on guitar and a drummer named Eric Singer. I went to see Paul perform and sat up in the balcony with Eric Carr. It was interesting, actually, watching Paul from the audience instead of standing next to him on stage. Eric Carr was concerned he would be replaced by Eric Singer, who was a terrific drummer and singer. At the end of Paul's tour, the two of us turned our attention back to Kiss. We were now making more money than we had even in the glory days of the '70s. Gone were the excesses of management perks, inefficient stage designs, and expensive recording sessions. In 1989, I found an inexpensive demo studio, and we recorded our next album, Hot in the Shade, there. It was done for a fraction of the usual costs, with no producer fees involved. We produced it ourselves. Paul wrote a song with Michael Bolton called Forever that made it into the top 10, and the ensuing tour was a big success. We had a 40-foot-high sphinx in the center of the stage, and we appeared in the mouth as the eyes were shooting flames and fog came out of the nose. With or without makeup, Kiss was selling out concerts again. Life has given me the opportunity to take advantage of my whims, at least to the point where I can get doors opened. One day I was sitting around thinking of other projects that interested me, and it suddenly occurred to me that I would like to have a record label. I had always taken an interest in younger bands. If there was a Geffen Records, I thought, why couldn't there be a Simmons record? At the time, the RCA label didn't really have a strong rock and roll presence, which seemed unfortunate to me. It had been the home of Elvis Presley. RCA seemed like a promise unfulfilled. As usual, I didn't bother with lawyers or complicated proposal letters. I just got on the telephone and called Bob Buziak, the president of RCA. I didn't get him. Instead, I got Heinz Henn, the European head who had seen Kiss in several German shows. Henn, Buziak, and I met, exchanged views and philosophies, and before I knew it, I had a record label, Simmons Records. The first album my label released was a self-titled debut by a band named House of Lords, which featured a guy named Greg Giuffria. He had been in a band named Angel that had signed to Casablanca Records on my recommendation, and then after that he had a band named Giuffria that had a big hit in the mid-'80s, a song called Call to the Heart. I signed Greg only on the condition that I would executive produce his record. I would have full control over the name, the look, everything. I didn't want the name to be Giuffria. I wanted them to be House of Lords, which was a name I owned and had trademarked. I wanted to direct their image. That record went to #1 on the UK import chart before it was ever released in the United States. Other bands followed, including a California rock band called Silent Rage. But the original concept got a bit blurred over time. For example, a band called Gypsy Rose was an act that RCA found. I didn't have anything to do with it, but they wanted me to put it out on my label for credibility purposes. I also courted Joe Walsh for a solo record and was managing, producing, and writing for many artists. I was still in Kiss, and even if I wasn't devoting my full attention to the band, I knew it had to remain a top priority. Pretty soon it became clear to me that there just wasn't enough hours in the day for me to manage my own label. When the time came, RCA didn't pick up the option, and Simmons Records disappeared. As I write this book, though, I'm talking to several major labels about reviving Simmons Records. During the summer break from the Hot in the Shade tour, I came back to L.A. and to Shannon. I had it all. Kiss was doing well. I was living with a queen. What else could I want? I was about to find out. One evening, Shannon and I went to the Neil Bogart Memorial Cancer Fund event, which was being held at the Santa Monica racetrack. I was talking to Sherry Lansing and Joyce Bogart, and the conversation turned to marriage. I mentioned how scared I was of marriage. Well, Joyce said, "What about kids?" And before I could utter a word, Shannon said, in a voice just above a whisper, "I'm pregnant." I didn't hear her say it, not consciously. I heard the words, but they never connected with my brain. I never thought I would ever hear those words from anyone. I remember feeling dizzy as the blood rushed to my head. Before I knew it, Shannon and I were alone and facing each other. Everyone else had left us. I didn't say anything. I was holding my breath. So here it was, finally, the day I never thought would happen. What was I going to do? Would I accept my responsibility? More important, was this something that I might have wanted all along, but never had the courage to admit to myself? I looked into Shannon's eyes and saw that this was something she really wanted. I can't tell you why, but at that instant, I knew I wanted the same thing. I wanted to be a father. It wasn't the notion, well, this is supposed to happen. I just knew it deep inside. Over the course of her pregnancy, Shannon became quite voluptuous and even more desirable. She was sexy and curvaceous. I couldn't keep my hands off her. As the pregnancy went along, we joked that she needed a suit of armor to protect her from me. I had become something of an expert at keeping my emotions under control. Suddenly, pure white fear started to creep in. Oh my God, I thought. There's going to be a baby. Is it going to be a boy or a girl? And, oh my God, what if it's a girl? How do I talk to a girl? All these things that I never verbalized, that I never even dared think of, were suddenly upon me. I was a wreck. I have to say, Shannon had a little morning sickness. It was nothing out of the ordinary for a pregnant woman, but for me, it was all out of the ordinary, and I was very concerned about her and the baby. Kiss went on tour to Europe, and I took Shannon along. It was the first time I had taken a girl on tour with me. I tried to explain what touring was about. She saw girls lifting their tops during the shows. She answered the phones when the girls would call. She was a good sport about it. When we were in London to play Wembley Stadium, I saw a girl I may have had a liaison with, I can't recall. I mentioned this to Shannon, who was now visibly pregnant. The girl followed me around, and one day I answered the front door to find her standing there. With Shannon in the background, she offered to kick Shannon's stomach to kill the baby. She ran off when she heard Shannon coming. When we came back to America, we went to see a doctor. At one point, he asked if we wanted to know the sex of the baby. We did, so they set up an ultrasound machine to look into Shannon to actually see the outline of the baby. This was about a month before the birth. I thought I was watching a science fiction movie, with the baby inside, moving. So, the doctor said, I suppose you'd want to know that you're going to have a boy. Well, yeah, sure, I can tell. I thought that he was going to be the most well-endowed son on the face of the planet. But it turns out that what I was looking at was the umbilical cord. The thing looked longer than his leg, which in fact it was. But what did I know about umbilical cords? I just wanted the best for my son. Finally, Shannon went into labor in the middle of the night. We got into the car, and I drove her to the hospital. It was all very calm. We had taken Lamaze classes and knew that we were supposed to control labor with breathing, not rush to the hospital in a panic, but take it slow and easy. When she went into the delivery room, it was for a labor that lasted about 23 hours. Every once in a while, I'd go into the room and feed Shannon some ice cubes. We've always joked around a lot, so while she was in pain, she'd say, "Don't ever touch me again. Don't you ever put your hands on me again. Look what you've done." The jokes would soon die away because the pain would come back. I was there for every second of that birth. I watched the birth happen. I was the first person to see the crown of my son's head appear. I was the first person who held my son. When my son first opened his eyes, he saw me. I was the first thing he saw. I cut the umbilical cord. You have to cut it twice, once in the middle and once up close. Nicholas Adam Tweed Simmons was born at 8 pounds, 11 ounces. Aside from a man's own birth and death, I would have to say the birth of his child is probably the pivotal point in his life. Emotions were running like crazy. I felt like I was on a roller coaster ride. I don't know if I ever blinked my eyes, but I have the sense that I didn't. I wanted to keep all my senses wide open so I could record this moment, which I never imagined would ever happen. There I was, holding in my arms a real live human being who was looking at me and who was going to be looking to me for everything, for life, for sustenance, for knowledge. I was going to have to be there. They talk about the maternal instinct, but there's a paternal instinct too, I'm sure. A man came toward me, and I heard these soothing words. "All right, Gene, that's the doctor. He's going to take the baby and clean him up." While I understood the words intellectually, I emotionally didn't want to let my baby go. I kept repeating this to my son, to Shannon, to the doctor. I didn't want to let him go. I remember resolving that if it came to it, I would fight to the death. It was like when guys fight on the street, when you're fighting to the death, when an animal's cornered, fists aren't even an issue. I had a picture in my mind of completely enveloping the doctor with my legs and arms and sinking my teeth into his neck. I would cut his jugular and kill him where he stood because he was taking my son. To this day I have a mental picture of that poor innocent doctor in his death throes. He's drowning in his own blood, with his jugular completely torn apart, and my face is covered with his blood. I had never felt anything like that before in my life. I didn't understand that kind of rage. I remember Shannon saying something like, "Gene, it's okay." I must have had my eyes wide open and my nostrils flaring. I gave up my son to the doctor, but what they did next seemed like torture. They took Nicholas's finger and stuck it with something sharp so it bled. I wanted to kill the nurse, even after she explained to me that they were testing for clotting factors. Then they stuck a tube down his nose and his throat to get all the liquids. They put things in his eyes. They circumcised him. Then it was all over. I don't know that I slept at all for 2 or 3 days. I must have stayed awake around the clock, just watching Nicholas. He kept looking at me. I felt a little inadequate. As a man, all I knew how to do was make money and chase skirt. And all of a sudden, here was a baby who was now depending on me for everything. Was I doing it right? Who knew? What do you do when a baby poops in your hand as you're holding him? Do you put him down? Do you wipe? Help! That's all I remember saying for many weeks. The months went by, and the first word he said was, "Daddy." I remember my knees buckling. I thought about taking all my credit cards and saying, "Here, it's all yours. Just keep saying Daddy." I never thought I'd ever hear those words from anybody. It's true that I lived with Cher's children and Diana's children, but they were at ages where they could take care of themselves. Here instead were the challenges of real fatherhood, and for me there was an additional challenge. Would I be like my own father, or would I stick around and do what I was supposed to do? In my mind, but most important in my heart, there was never any question. Nicholas was a dream baby. When he'd cry in the middle of the night, I would jump up and run to him. Not that I would necessarily know what the hell to do when I got there. One afternoon between tours, Shannon was changing his diaper, and she called to me to come in and help. I rushed in, and she asked me to take over. I grabbed both sides of the diaper as if I were a skilled surgeon, and was admiring the fact that my son was defying gravity with his appendage even at such an early age. I remember smiling as I leaned over to close the diaper when Nick let me have it straight in the face. I caught Shannon laughing in the other room. She had timed it just right. When he turned 2, I arranged for a full petting zoo to be brought over and set up on the tennis court. There were more kids and parents there than I had ever seen assembled in one place. Besides all the ducks, rabbits, and rams, there was a miniature horse. Nick was helped on and took his first ride. I had to wait until I was about 7 to get dressed up as a cowboy back in Israel. I never got a chance then to ride a horse. My son would beat me to it by the time he was 2. I was reliving my childhood through my son. I was able to speak English, Hungarian, and Hebrew, as well as some German and a few Japanese phrases. I had a BA in education and had taught 6th grade. I was a self-made man, and yet I found Shannon had a sort of life wisdom I never even contemplated. For one thing, prior to becoming a father, I never really imagined wanting children. After becoming a father, I couldn't imagine not wanting children. Shannon seemed to know this about me. She never questioned my decisions about not wanting marriage or children, but she didn't seem as shocked as I was at how much I loved being a father. At an early age, my mother used to tell me, "I would throw myself in front of that truck for you." I never knew what she meant by that. Why would she want to do that? Later, I found myself telling Nicholas the same phrase. I'm sure he thought the same thing I had. By Nick's second year, he slept with us in a 6.5-foot wide, 7-foot long, gigantic bed. The accepted wisdom was to let your child sleep alone. We didn't care. We wanted to be together 24 hours a day. California was everything New York wasn't. The weather was paradise, and people seemed nicer. I'm reminded of the New York joke that goes, "A man from California visits New York and asks the first gentleman he meets, 'Excuse me, sir, is this the way to the Empire State Building, or should I just go fuck myself?'" I was to find out that paradise had its problems as well. Late one night, the silence was shattered by a 6.7 earthquake that shook Los Angeles within a 150-mile radius. It literally shook like a carnival ride. I immediately jumped up and grabbed Nicholas, and with Shannon running behind, we first stood in the doorway of the bedroom, and then ran down the stairs that were shaking and swinging. Luckily, the house was not damaged much, but when we watched the news, it looked as if Los Angeles had been in a war zone. I wasn't the only one who was feeling the pull of domesticity. A few years later, Paul met Pam Bowen and soon decided to marry her. The wedding was to be held at the Bel Air Hotel. Before the event, I racked my brain for a present. I just couldn't figure out what to get Paul to show him how much he meant to me. I was the best man, and at the wedding I was scared stiff. It wasn't my wedding, but it was close enough. Afterward, we went inside for food and music. Guests got up and wished Paul and Pam all the best. At one point, I grabbed the microphone and asked Paul for his permission to do something out of the ordinary. Then I parted the curtain and gave the stagehands a nod. They brought out a large television set. I stuck a cassette into the video machine, and there was Tony Bennett, holding a champagne glass in his hand. He toasted the couple, sang "To the Good Life," and wished Paul and Pam all the happiness in the world. I had called Tony Bennett, and he was kind enough to make all this happen. A kinder and classier guy doesn't exist. It was an era of good feeling, a time when emotional bonds were solidifying, and new life seemed to be blooming everywhere. Maybe it was inevitable then that the happiness would be counterbalanced by some sadness. When we got off tour, Eric Carr called me and told me that he had woken up one morning coughing blood. The very thought sent a chill up my spine. He was immediately placed in the hospital, where doctors found a growth on his heart. They told him that he would need emergency open-heart surgery. Paul and I immediately flew to New York to be with Eric the night before the operation. When I walked into his room, he was in great spirits, alert and joking. We offered to get him anything he wanted. He asked for a McDonald's hamburger and fries, which was what he practically lived on while we were touring. We brought back the food, and we all joked together before we left. A few days later, we visited Eric in the hospital again. All had gone well, he said. The doctors were happy with the results. Paul and I felt relieved. What we didn't know, what Eric wasn't telling us, was that he had cancer. Fairly quickly, he became very ill. He lost all his hair, his huge Italian afro, and it broke our hearts. We were getting ready to record an album that we planned to call Revenge, and Paul and I decided that although we would pay for all of Eric's medical expenses and do whatever we could to help him fight his illness, we needed to start our album. At least for a time, that meant replacing him with a studio drummer. We tried our best to explain, but I'm sure it still hurt him. By early 1991, we had decided to give Bob Ezrin another shot at producing. We still felt that Destroyer was one of the strongest albums we'd ever made, and while we weren't sure Bob was up to it, especially after the bad experience of The Elder, we were interested enough to do one song with him as a kind of test. The producers of the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure needed a song for their soundtrack, and they wanted us to record God Gave Rock and Roll to You. Bob, Paul, and I rewrote the lyrics and re-recorded the song, which went into the top 10 in England. That was reason enough to stick with Bob for a full record. Since Eric Carr was still sick, we went through another round of drum auditions. After we failed to find the right drummer, Paul suggested Eric Singer for the album and brought him on for a few months. Eric Singer was a very funny guy, completely professional. We were not planning to bring him into the band, since we were hoping for Eric Carr's recovery. When it came time to shoot the video for God Gave Rock and Roll to You, Eric Carr begged to be in the video, even though he hadn't played on the recording. We were concerned about whether he was healthy enough or strong enough to do it, but we agreed. Eric showed up and stayed until the very end of the video shoot, which lasted until 3 a.m. He never complained, not once. I believed that he could somehow turn things around. It was not to be. During the recordings of Revenge in 1991, Eric Carr passed away. We were devastated and flew to New York for the funeral. Ace showed up as well to pay his respects. We said hello to each other, but sat in different parts of the church. The fans lined the driveway leading up to the church, and everyone was in tears. The fans had loved Eric, and they weren't the only ones. It devastated everybody. Whether Ace cared for Paul or myself at that point, nobody can say. But he always felt very close to Eric. The biggest concern that Eric Carr ever had was that Peter Criss might have hated him for taking his place in the band. He didn't want Peter to think that he usurped him on purpose, or that he didn't respect what Peter had contributed to the band. When he first met Peter, he said, "I'm so sorry." It stopped Peter in his tracks. I think he had expected to be defensive around Eric, to try to size him up and convince himself that Eric wasn't as good a drummer as he was. But he was completely taken aback by Eric's kindness. Peter speaks fondly of him even today. Saddened, sobered, we resumed work on Revenge. One evening I went to see a group I had produced, Easy O, perform in a club. Vinnie Vincent came up to me and apologized for causing the band so much grief while he was a member. He wanted to patch things up and wondered if I would consider writing some songs with him. Sure, I said. I wanted to let bygones be bygones. I called Paul and told him that Vinnie had apparently changed. Paul wrote songs with him as well, and before the album was released, Vinnie was up to his old tricks again. He reneged on a signed deal we had made and decided that he wanted to renegotiate. He eventually sued us and lost. As far as I was concerned, he was persona non grata forever. Away from us, he didn't exactly thrive. He formed a band called the Vinnie Vincent Invasion and signed to Chrysalis Records, but he managed only a couple of records before he was dropped. Actually, the band as a whole wasn't dropped. Chrysalis re-signed everyone else and renamed the band Slaughter, who then went on to achieve platinum sales. Vinnie then signed a deal with Enigma, but no record was ever released. People at the label told me that he had erased his own master tapes because he didn't think the material was good enough. He may have been right. In 1992, Revenge came out and did well, going gold. We wanted to go back on tour with Eric Singer and did a series of club dates to introduce him to our faithful fans. Then we went out on a very successful arena tour. The stage show featured a Statue of Liberty motif. We felt as if Seattle and the grunge bands had killed rock and roll. There was so much bad press for any band that got up on stage to put up a straight show. Grunge killed off the marketplace entirely. There were no lights, no costumes, and by the millions, white kids went over to rap because bands looked like bums. At least rappers were talking about girls and money. A decade later, the grunge bands are dead, and the hair bands that they knocked off the map are back with successful summer package tours. Shannon got pregnant again, and this time it was a girl. By then I'd become a full-time father. I had bought roller skates, taken my son for ice cream, and passed on my knowledge. I have pictures of myself as a baby, and Nicholas as a baby, and we look like twins. He was a miniature version of me, and in some ways, that made the experience easier to handle psychologically. But how would I handle a little girl? How did little girls think? I had so many worries, but all of them evaporated the minute I saw Sophie. I was smitten immediately. She tilted her head to one side, and I was gone. One of Sophie's first sentences was, "Daddy, it doesn't suck." She was pointing to her bottle. At the age of 3, she said, "Daddy, can I have a Porsche?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'll buy you a whole fleet of them." Being a father the second time was just as wonderful, if not more so. The last thing on my mind had been kids. I thought I would die with my freedom. Underneath that, of course, it was all about fear. I didn't want to run out on my kids when they were 6 or 7, the way my father had run out on me. I wanted to be there. I wanted my kids to know I would always be there for them, and I wanted them to respect me. Part of gaining that respect was explaining to them how Shannon and I had chosen to live and conduct ourselves as parents. My philosophy was simple. I always felt that in this predetermined world, you should take every opportunity to change things to suit you. If you don't like your name, pick another. If you want to straighten your hair, straighten it. If you can't stand where you're living, move. My kids have both Tweed and Simmons as their last names, but when they get older, they will have the chance to keep or change their names. Shannon and I also tried to clarify our arrangement. As soon as our children were old enough to understand, we explained that we weren't married and that we were together because we wanted to be. They accepted this, more or less. And where it confused them, we took pains to discuss it at great length. Both Nicholas and Sophie have had classmates and friends whose parents were separated or divorced, and Shannon pointed out to them that this was a painful situation, especially because it required breaking an oath. All in all, I have encouraged them to think of themselves as individuals. When you create a painting, it has to be original. Don't paint by numbers. All these metaphors are long-winded ways of saying something very simple. Trust yourself to be your own guide. As I write this book, Nicholas is 12, Sophie is 9. He didn't miss a day of school between 1st and 5th grade, and is in advanced studies in 6th grade, as well as having another year of perfect attendance. She constantly earns Best Student Awards. They are wonderful, loving children, and I would do anything for them. I don't know if life can get better, and they are a large part of why I feel this way. I can see the way they have changed my life every time I visit my mother's house. I'm an only child, remember, and for many years my mother's house was a shrine to me. You couldn't find a spot on the wall without a picture of me. Here's Jean eating in a high chair, there's Jean playing, there's Jean standing around doing nothing. Now I go over there, and if I'm lucky, I can find a few pictures of me pushed to the back of a table. The rest have been replaced by pictures of my kids. My mother has gone from being the world's most indulgent, wonderful, loving parent to being the world's most indulgent, wonderful, loving grandparent. Reason to Live, Face to Face with the Kiss Army, 1993 to 1995. When all the planets line up, you have a chance either to take advantage of it or else to miss the opportunity. I'd always been aware of our passionate fans, and in the mid-1990s they started holding Kiss conventions, in which they got together, dressed up in makeup, and celebrated the Kiss experience. not only buying and trading memorabilia, but having discussions, showing concert films, and so on. It was a real gathering of the tribe. I read about these conventions and wished I could be there. They had a sense of purpose and togetherness that seemed very genuine, especially in light of all the excess and artificiality we had endured. And then it hit me. We could just hold our own KISS conventions. KISS had always been about the fans, and we had always been the quintessential American band, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Yet we had grown to the point that we were surrounded by bodyguards and had a moat around the stage. Why didn't we make ourselves available? Why didn't we sit up on that stage, answer questions from the heart, and interact with people who had made us who we were? I needed to find someone who could help me make this convention idea into a reality. I had produced 2 albums by a band named Black and Blue, and I went to their guitar player, Tommy Thayer, and sat him down for a heart-to-heart conversation. I told him that his band was not going to make it. I told him that in my estimation, he had come to a crossroads in his life, and that soon he was going to have to make a choice. He could go into the real world and get a real job, or else he could come work with me. He wanted to know what kind of job I was offering him. I said, I don't know. Every day I'll get up and I'll let you know what your job is going to be. And if you're going to say I don't do windows, you better tell me no now, because whatever has to be done, including getting the coffee, is what you'll do, or else don't do it. Tommy didn't even blink. He just rolled up his sleeves and said, okay, what do you want to do? Without any experience, Tommy and I started to research the possibility of hosting these conventions. The first thing that struck me was the problem of our liability. If we hosted a KISS convention, and if we had parking, and a guy cracked up his car, he might sue us. And if we served food and somebody got food poisoning, she might sue us. If we rented a concert hall and it caught on fire, or there was an accident, more lawsuits. So we needed a place where we could put up a suit-proof convention, a place where I didn't have to staff up and hire personnel to take care of parking, catering, and so forth. The answer seemed to be hotel ballrooms. I made an initial phone call or 2 just to see how it would work. It turned out that it was pretty reasonable to rent out a ballroom for 12 hours or so, assuming we let the hotel keep all the parking fees, the money from the food, and any receipts if the conventioneers decided to spend the night. I sent Tommy Thayer on a trip across the country, lining up the cities. At the same time, I personally sent out mailings to fans, especially those within small communities, so they could be part of the conventions. When the convention started, the crew was pretty small. Me and Paul, Tommy Thayer, Eric Singer, and Bruce Kulick. Tommy arranged with some other guys locally to put together a lot of the memorabilia that I had saved, plus the KISS outfits, and to display it all in a kind of KISS Hall of Fame, with 7-foot-high plexiglass enclosures. At the conventions, we had show and tell. We played an acoustic set. We answered questions from fans, and we answered them truthfully, which means that the answers weren't always happy ones. If a fan asked, "Is it true that Ace drinks?" my answer would be yes. If a fan asked, "Did Ace play on Flaming Youth?" my answer would be no. This was long before that Storytellers series on VH1, but that was the sense of it if you add in an extensive autograph session afterward. It was 12 hours solid with the fans. We did 23 cities total, and the very first one was in Los Angeles at a Hilton hotel. By this point, Peter Criss's daughter was in her teens. She'd never seen KISS in makeup and had only heard about it from her father. She wanted to go to the LA convention. So Peter called a journalist and wanted to know if the journalist could arrange for him and his daughter to go to the convention. The journalist called me immediately, and I called Peter. "Peter," I said, "you don't have to ask somebody else. You're a part of the band's history. This should be your place too. We'll send a limo to pick you up. You'll be treated like a king because you are. Whatever you want is yours. For a few years, I hadn't seen much of either Ace or Peter. Through the mid-1990s, I had worked on a number of side projects, producing acts like Black and Blue, Tommy Thayer's band, Wendy O. Williams of the Plasmatics, Keel and Easy O, and sometimes I invited Peter and Ace on these projects. But I didn't have any real thoughts of bringing them back into Kiss. Ace and Peter had become so crippled by their emotional problems and by various substances, they had become so diminished as human beings and as musicians, that they would have been an embarrassment. It's one thing to get together again in a room and trade old stories, but when you put the makeup back on and step up on that stage, how are you going to be convincing? Still, I thought Peter deserved his spot on stage at these conventions. There's a funny side note to this story. About 6 months earlier, Tom and Roseanne Arnold, they were together at that point, had called me to find out if I wanted to contribute to or somehow get involved in the Peter Criss Fund. They had read that Peter was down on his luck, that he was homeless and living under a bridge. I told them, don't pay attention to those stories, they're not true. It may be true that Peter is broke, but I don't think he's living under a bridge. They insisted that they had read this piece and heard the same news from others. 2 or 3 months after that, I was watching Phil Donahue's show, and the guest was none other than Peter Criss, talking about a guy who was living under a bridge and who bore a rough resemblance to Peter. One of the tabloids had either paid this guy or swallowed his story, and this trumped-up tale about Peter living under a bridge began to make the rounds. So that was how Peter reappeared on my radar. By this time, both Ace and Peter were relegated to playing clubs, and at one point, they decided to tour together as the Bad Boys of Rock. They were playing Kiss songs, but they couldn't use the Kiss logos or makeup. Peter would later tell me that being on tour with Ace was not easy, because Ace would continually be drunk or high, and because there was always a big discussion about who was going to headline. This was during their 1994 tour. I invited Peter to come down to the convention, and Eric Singer, God bless him, said, "You know what? You should ask him if he wants to come up when we do our acoustic set. Maybe he'll want to sing a song or two. I'm sure the fans would love it." When Eric said that, we all looked at each other and said, "Sure, why not?" Before the convention, we got together and rehearsed with Peter. He tried playing drums, but it was substandard. So Eric Singer decided to play the drums behind Peter, while Peter just got up on a stool and sang. As it turned out, it was a heartwarming experience. I looked across the stage and thought it was a real shame that Peter's other problems had prevented him from doing his best for the band and for himself, because the fans loved it. They were having so much fun, and so was I, to be honest. I wish we could have isolated the moment in time when we sang those 2 songs together. It was magic. It wasn't just seeing Peter that made those Kiss conventions magic, as we learned from the other ones. The experience of doing them really opened up our eyes to the living, breathing thing that we had created, above and beyond the records and songs. There it was, the Kiss Army, the Kiss Nation, alive and well. Clearly, what was running through their veins was belief in this bizarre thing that we had created. Children were named after our songs. We would meet them. "Hi, I'm Christine. I can't wait to turn 16 so I can become Christine 16. And they'd giggle. "Meet my daughter, Beth." On and on and on. "What's your name?" "I'm Dr. Love." "Oh, really? And what's your name?" "I'm Mr. Speed." Sometimes there would even be weddings at the conventions, and the bride and groom would wear full Kiss makeup. One of the most gratifying parts of the shows was the fan testimonials. People would tell us that they had been outcasts, nobodies, until they heard Kiss, and from then on they had a refuge. It almost sounded religious. Girls wanted to come up and kiss us, and that was funny, and everybody got a kick out of it. But sometimes we would all, Paul, me, Eric, and Bruce, get lumps in our throats. At one of the conventions, an attractive young woman got up and told us about her boyfriend. They had met, fallen in love, and gotten engaged. Then out of the blue he had gotten cancer, and when it became clear he was going to die, he called off the wedding, because he didn't want to affect her life in this way, even though she was still willing to go through with it. Before he died, he asked her one thing: "Would you please bury my Kiss records with me?" She explained to the rest of the people at the convention that the idea that someone could love a band so much had seemed strange to her. "Now I understand," she said. Then she collapsed, just burst into tears, and the whole place went silent out of respect and admiration for this woman. So often we'd get off that stage exhausted, not just because we were there for hours, but because it was emotionally draining. The conventions reminded us how much the fans loved us and how much we loved the fans. When Peter left the convention in Los Angeles, he went home and picked up the phone and called Ace and told him what a rush it was and how great it felt. Ace expressed an interest in participating too. As we went along on the convention trail, people started to talk about them. The word of mouth was tremendous. At some point, MTV sent crews out, and one of the people to take notice was a guy named Alex Coletti, the producer of MTV's Unplugged series. We had been filming every one of these conventions because we wanted to put out a long-form video about them. Coletti saw the tape of fans getting up on stage and jamming with us, and people crying. "Why doesn't Kiss bring its convention to the MTV studios and do an episode of Unplugged?" he said. Paul and I talked about it and decided to invite Peter and Ace to join us, not for the New York Kiss convention, but for the Unplugged taping. We would have the entire Kiss lineup: Eric, Bruce, Ace, Peter, Gene, and Paul. And when Ace and Peter went on, Eric and Bruce would be off stage, out of respect for them, so they could sing their songs. Then we'd all get together and do one or two together as a band. When I called Peter to tell him about it, he jumped at the opportunity right away. When I called Ace, he said, "That sounds great. Thanks so much for calling me. My manager is George Sewitt." George Sewitt was initially our security guy. He was very adept in martial arts. Then, somehow, he had expanded into management and started representing Ace and Vinnie Vincent. When Vinnie Vincent left, Sewitt took on another client, Peter Criss. As a result of Ace using Sewitt as a go-between, the negotiations for this one-off Kiss reunion on Unplugged became all-consuming for me. I had daily discussions with Sewitt about the fact that there wouldn't be any pay, that we were just doing this for MTV, that we would play just 2 songs with the band, that we would retain the rights to release the performance as a long-form video, and so forth. Part of what took so long was my own meticulousness. I'm all about making a list and checking it twice. Other people let lawyers take over. I don't. But another reason the negotiations became so protracted was Ace himself. Initially, Ace said, "Sure, I'll show up with my guitar and we'll do a couple of songs together. That's great. I look forward to it. Thanks so much." And then came a series of conversations where Ace wanted a suite, and then a pair of roadies, and then $5,000 for guitar strings and popcorn and peanuts. Then he wanted another suite for his daughter. At one point, George Sewitt was calling MTV directly. I immediately cut him off at the pass. "You're not to call MTV," I said. "You don't represent Kiss, and this is a Kiss show. We will let you know where to go and what time to show up. You may be Ace's manager, but please don't get confused about what that means." I had to be stern because MTV would listen to anybody who represented themselves as being part of Kiss. The left hand was the same as the right hand in their estimation. Even though Paul and I were trying to keep on the best friendly face, dealing with Ace and George Sewitt was torture. The deal kept changing every single day. And with Peter, it was always walking on thin ice because he was shaky emotionally. He was alone at that point, between marriages. His daughter was on the West Coast with his former wife, who didn't have the kindest things to say about Peter. We had no problems with the rest of the guys. Through the entire reunion process, Bruce and Eric were terrific. They were the sweetest, most professional guys. They never said anything bad about anybody. They always did their job, always showed up on time. They were real gentlemen who put their egos aside for the good of the fans. In fact, they were so accommodating that they planted the seeds for what would become their worst nightmare. Their kindness enabled Ace and Peter to step in and, unfortunately, put them out of a job. We rehearsed at SIR Studios in New York. Peter walked in with his head down, and we immediately hugged him and told him to have a good time. Then Ace walked in, and we started working. It became very clear immediately that Ace's guitar playing had sunk to a club level, and we made sure that Eric Singer played drums along with Peter just to keep him in time. But no matter what the problems were, whenever it was time for them to come on, Ace stepped up and that magic thing happened. Despite all the problems, despite all the torture, when we played together, it felt like 1974 again. We weren't as good as we were with Eric or Bruce, not as proficient or as tuneful, but we had a kind of swagger, a loose rock and roll thing that perhaps the Stones have always been more about than the Beatles. The fans loved it. It looked great. Afterward, we shook hands and wished each other luck. We didn't think for a second about reforming the band, mainly because we had to fly to Los Angeles to mix our new album, Carnival of Souls. The conventions had reminded me that our fans were among the most passionate in the world. Plenty of other rock stars were Kiss fans, too, either openly or secretly, and one day I got an idea for a Kiss tribute album. I wanted the top stars of the day to play their favorite Kiss songs. Paul didn't get it, and didn't think the record company would go for it. They did. Paul and I went to New York and sold it as a Kiss record so that we could get our millions in advance, despite the fact that the band ended up appearing on only one song. Then on my own, I started making all the calls. One of the first was to Neil Young, through his manager Elliot Roberts, who must have thought I was on crack. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You want Neil Young to appear on a Kiss tribute album?" And I said, "That's right, why shouldn't he?" I made the same calls to Madonna's people because I wanted her to cover I Was Made for Loving You, and on and on. I worked the phones for about 10 hours a day for 2 months straight, calling everybody in the universe. I lined up Ozzy Osbourne to team up with Stone Temple Pilots on War Machine. I got 9 Inch Nails to agree to a cover of Love Gun. I had Sir Mix-a-Lot doing a rap version of Rock and Roll All Night. I didn't care if they were my taste or not. I wanted a stellar lineup because at the end I'm all about winning the prize. How you get there doesn't matter. The conception of the project was beautiful. The execution was trickier, mainly because the record companies got in the way. One of their complaints was that I wasn't paying the bands very much to do the tracks. My attitude was that it was just for fun, that they should get into the studio and knock something out and see if it worked. Many of the musicians agreed with me. Lenny Kravitz, for example, did a cover of Deuce, and after he sent the tape, he told me he had this fantasy of Stevie Wonder playing harmonica on the track. So I called Stevie. I had met him only once, when Diana Ross and I went to see him at Wembley in London, but he got on the telephone and immediately agreed. He and his assistant came down to Cherokee Studios, and I put on the Lenny Kravitz song, and he said, "Okay, what do you want me to play?" All of a sudden, this voice in my head said, "Oh my God, I'm going to be telling Stevie Wonder what to play on his harp." I improvised a little melody, and he played it back immediately. Finally, I said, "You know what? I feel awkward telling Stevie Wonder to do anything. Why don't you just do what you do? Just let the song go by. I'll play it twice, then just put down what you feel." Within 2 or 3 takes, he did it, and thank you very much. He is a genius. The other big coup was getting Garth Brooks. Garth came through Paul, who had met him, and when I first spoke with Garth, he agreed to contribute a song to the record on one condition, that Kiss back him up on Hard Luck Woman. We flew into Nashville at night, didn't tell anybody. We had no bodyguards. We carried our own guitars. Garth was a complete gentleman. The whole studio was opened up for us. The song went smoothly. As it turned out, Garth was a huge Kiss fan. Queen and Kiss were his main influences when he was growing up. I had never seen the connection before, but that's because I knew Garth only from his records. When I finally saw him in concert, I understood what he was talking about. He was flying through the air, levitating the drums, shooting off fireworks. It was country Kiss. Even during this project, which was a tremendous amount of fun, the old Kiss problems cropped up again. Paul came up with an idea for the cover, a takeoff on the cover of Led Zeppelin's Presence, which shows a family sitting together at a table. We wanted to do a similar cover, but put the whole family in Kiss makeup. So Paul went down to a photo house, and we found a picture of an American family and put everybody's face in makeup. Somehow word got out, and somebody from Ace's camp called and told us that we couldn't use Ace's makeup. We checked the contracts, and the truth was that we were well within our rights. We owned the spaceman. But I didn't want to fight with Ace, so we decided to change the makeup. We went out of our way to make Ace and Peter feel good about the project. On the inside cover art, a handwritten note to the two of them said, "Dear Ace and Peter, hope you are well. This whole thing couldn't have happened without you." It was a very friendly note, very honest. When the album Kiss My Ass came out, it did very well and became another platinum record for us. We played with Garth on The Tonight Show, and life continued to be stress-free without Ace and Peter. By the 1990s, grunge music was the most popular style of rock and roll. Thanks to bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden, it was dominant on the airwaves and on MTV. While we were making Carnival of Souls, we made a conscious effort to reinvent ourselves again, this time with swampy guitars and more alienation in the lyrics. The result wasn't very convincing. We enjoyed making it. We had plenty of interesting times. We learned more about this new style and about our own musical abilities. But as we mixed the record, we realized that that version of Kiss had run its course. I called George Suett to explore whether Ace and Peter, both of whom were now chemical-free, I was told, were up for a reunion. Direct communication with Ace and Peter was always difficult. Neither of them had people skills, and they never answered their phones. Peter always had a roadie who would be his mouthpiece, and Ace always liked to have a manager or a keeper around him. I told George that I would fly to New York to meet him at our lawyer's office, although the lawyer wouldn't be present, just George and me. At that meeting, I told him what Kiss would be willing to offer Ace for rejoining the band for a tour. I showed him how much ticket prices would run, how many people I thought would show up at the concerts, what the capacity of the concert halls would be, and so on. George studied the figure and then said, "Well, that's an offer, but how come it's not bigger?" "Because," I said, "this is not a negotiation. This is an offer of employment. For 15 years," I explained, "we'd gotten along fine. We had made Kiss into a very big international band without makeup, without Ace, and without Peter. The only way we would even think about letting the two of them back in was under an employment agreement. We were not interested in being partners. If Ace wanted to come on board and become a multimillionaire yet again, we'd be happy to have him. We offered the same to Peter. This was a guaranteed number," I explained. "If the tour bombed, Paul and I would be on the hook. If it worked out, we might win big. Either way, Ace was guaranteed to be a multimillionaire." George and I parted cordially. I told him he had 2 or 3 days to decide. To George's credit, he saw the big picture, and shortly thereafter called me to say, "It's a deal." Ace and Peter both flew out to Los Angeles and came to my guest house for a band meeting. I told everybody how happy I was to do this, how thrilled I was that we had come to an agreement. Then Ace turned around and reneged. "I don't care what you give Peter," he said. "I want more." Peter was beside himself because it was the same old stuff again, the two weaker members of the band playing off each other. Our instinct was to flatly say no to this demand, but we didn't want the deal to dissipate, so we agreed. The next day, Ace changed the deal again. "I want an equal split," he said. We said, "That's the end of the deal. Thank you very much. Goodbye. It's been nice knowing you. God bless." Ace then backpedaled explained that he had to have more than Peter, even if it was only slightly more. He kept insisting, and still does, that he was much more important than Peter. This was all about self-esteem. This was classic Ace. We always wondered whether he would do the work he said he would do and stand by the agreements he entered. We probably had legal standing to sue Ace, but despite all the dysfunctional elements, we've always looked at Kiss as a family. We had once sued Polygram Records and won. We had sued Howard Marks, our former business manager, and won. We have yet to lose a suit, but we didn't want to resort to that with either Ace or Peter. Once the band did finally get together, once the numbers were set, I personally typed up a list of conditions. First, whether the tour was doing well or miserably, we could pull the plug at any time. Period. Also, all band members were to show up on time. They were to do interviews when asked. There were going to be strenuous rehearsals. Peter's drumming had deteriorated to an unacceptable level, and he could not remember his parts. Likewise, Ace's guitar playing had become a shadow of its former self. Ace's memory did not serve him well either. Decades of self-abuse had, in my opinion, taken their toll. Tommy Thayer, who had been in a Kiss tribute band after Black and Blue, knew all of Ace's solos inside out, and he had to teach them back to Ace. We insisted that there would be a workout regimen with personal trainers every morning, and then arduous rehearsals with no drugs and no booze. If anyone used, they were gone. Right away, Ace broke almost every rule. Peter, to his credit, showed up on time and worked hard. But Ace didn't show up on time. He didn't talk to the press. By the second or third week of rehearsals, I faxed George Sewitt saying, "We're ready to pull the plug. Ace Frehley is not a team player." George Sewitt suggested we have a heart-to-heart with Ace. So Paul, Ace, and I met at the Sunset Marquee about a month into rehearsals. Ace was full of excuses. His dog was sick. He was having trouble with his family. The government was hassling him about taxes. But he agreed to settle down. We were without a manager at that point, but we needed one. It became clear that this tour was going to be much bigger in scope than we'd expected. I called up ICM, CAA, and the major booking agencies to test the waters, to see what percentage we could get from a booking agency. I explained that Kiss was reuniting and that we were interested in having a manager come on board, but that we were not interested in paying a percentage of gross, only net. We had come too far along in this business. We knew too much. Nobody was going to get a percentage of the gross before we paid expenses. They could participate after we paid all the expenses, but there was no way they would make more money than we would. At some point in the search for a manager, I suggested Doc McGee. We had given Motley Crue and Bon Jovi their first tours, and Doc had managed them both. We made him an offer, stressing that the terms weren't really flexible. He accepted. Right away, Doc's involvement paid dividends. While talking to an agent and CAA, he came up with this idea that we should appear on the Grammy Awards, not perform, not even say a word, just appear in full makeup and costumes next to Tupac Shakur. If you do that, Doc said, then people will know the band is back together. That's exactly what we did. There was no press, no nothing. We sidled right up to Tupac, who was going to present an award. By that point, the word had leaked. A few minutes before, we'd passed by the backstage green room, where all the stars hang out and wait for their turn to get up in front of the microphone. Everybody was there, from Gloria Estefan to Luther Vandross. As we passed by the green room, all the stars went into shock. "Hey, look," someone said. Then the whole green room erupted with applause. Once we saw how these celebrities reacted, without any prompting, then we knew this was real. Before a single ticket was sold, before a single review was written, we knew it was the right time. The planets had lined up. Tupac announced to the audience that he had a surprise, and we walked out onto the stage. The first guy who jumped up was Eddie Vedder. Then the whole crowd jumped to its feet. We were back. Forever Reunions and Farewells, 1996 to 2001. The Grammy Awards ceremony was the beginning of our comeback trail. Within about a month, Doc decided to book Detroit's Tiger Stadium as the first show. It sounded like the height of lunacy to us. The safe way would have been to test our act in a smaller market, someplace like Dothan, Alabama, where we could sharpen our act, and the problems in the show wouldn't be scrutinized quite so intensely. But Doc booked a baseball stadium in Detroit. To be honest, we weren't even sure we would sell out the show. Tickets went on sale one Friday night. At 6 a.m. on Saturday, Doc called me at home to tell me that he had some good news and some bad news. I asked him for the bad news first. Well, he said, we don't have any more tickets to sell. We had sold out the whole stadium, about 50,000 seats, out in under an hour. I immediately called Peter and told him. He said, yeah, in a voice that made me believe he was still half asleep or didn't understand what I was telling him, but by the end of the conversation, he was hooting and hollering. Peter was so jubilant that for a minute I thought this tour might go smoothly, but it wasn't to be. We had a photo session with Barry Levine, who had worked with us back in 1976, and Ace complained that it was taking too long. Though we had intense personal training sessions with weights and aerobics to prepare us for the concerts, halfway through his session, Ace would stop. Peter didn't stop, but every step of the way he complained that the guy who was working him out was too demanding. Once Ace walked up to me in the parking lot of the rehearsal hall and said, I still don't have my weekly check, and if I don't get it by 5 o'clock today, I'm quitting the band. He always thought, and still does, that people are trying to cheat him. To Ace, it was always a conspiracy to do him in. Ace Frehley, more than anyone else in the band, seems to have a dark cloud over his head. He was and continues to be fearless in almost everything he does. In some ways, it's a quality I've always found fascinating because I don't have it myself. Where I am overly cautious about my health, Ace is the extreme opposite. He would drink until he passed out. He has used enough drugs to kill a lesser man. He has always been and continues to be unrepentant about all of that. He never cared about the effect his behavior had on anything or anyone, on the band, his personal relationships, or his health. I have to admit to being completely stumped. If someone were to jump off a building to commit suicide, at least he or she would have an audience. Ace prefers privacy, though. He never minded numbing himself alone. In fact, he seemed to relish the idea of going back to his room and knocking himself out. He would spend off days in his room and never come up for air. But despite all the self-destructive behavior, Ace is bright. He would tinker with little gadgets. He actually designed and built his own rocket-shooting device for his guitar in the early days, when the band was first touring. I was in the dressing room watching Ace solder wiring on his guitar for his effect, and as he turned to face me, I saw him solder his thumb to the guitar. When he felt pain, he screamed and yanked his hand away, but part of the skin of his thumb remained soldered to his guitar. Ace and Peter both have managed to cheat death more times than I can count. When Kiss opened up one of our early tours in Florida, in the days when guitars were still connected to amplifiers by jacks, electric wire connectors, Ace was electrocuted on stage in front of the audience, but rejoined us within a few minutes to finish the show. Peter was once hit with an M80 firework that was thrown on stage and was knocked off his drum riser. He had to be taken to the hospital. After he returned, the show went on. Ace has been chased by the police at speeds of 100 miles per hour and has walked away from crashes reasonably intact. He and Peter have both been in a number of terrible accidents and should have been killed. But Paul and I had put up with much of that throughout the years, and we were prepared to deal with it again. Before the Tiger Stadium tickets went up on sale in 1996, Doc McGee wanted to do a press conference in New York. and he had this idea of doing it at the New York Public Library on 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. I understood his rationale. He wanted a place that was easily accessible to all the national press, but I didn't want that locale. Libraries have nothing to do with KISS. Instead, I suggested that we go to the United Nations, which could represent KISS's global reach. Doc liked that, but he couldn't get the right permits. Then I remembered that in 1981, Diana Ross had gone on to the USS Intrepid aircraft carrier for a small press conference. I suggested to Doc that we do a KISS press conference on the Intrepid, which is permanently moored in the Hudson River on Manhattan's west side. Even though it was raining, the event was a huge success. Conan O'Brien introduced us, and we managed to attract television and press from 52 countries. When we took questions, I made sure that we had big signs in front of us with our names. Ace thought I was crazy. He thought everyone knew who he was. I had to explain to him that some countries didn't have any idea who KISS was anymore. Amazingly, at the press conference itself, Ace came off fine. Better than fine, in fact. He was very charming, very self-effacing. Those moments of good behavior were rare, though. We took over Cobo Hall in Detroit, where we had recorded a live to rehearse for the Tiger Stadium show. Peter, Paul, and I, plus the road crew and everybody else, got there and got settled. While we were unpacking, someone came up and told me that Ace had not yet made it to Detroit. This was to be the first day of rehearsal for our biggest tour in almost 2 decades, and he couldn't get there on time. We booked him another flight, and he missed that one too. Then we booked a third one, which he also missed. When Ace finally walked into rehearsal and said something about how hard it was to pack, I basically tore him a new asshole. I told him he was a loser, that this was his last chance to get on his feet. I told him that he should be ashamed of himself, keeping the entire band and crew waiting. If you can't do the job, I said, get the fuck out. Ace exploded right back at me and told me to go fuck myself. Then he left. When he was gone, Paul turned to me and asked me to smooth things over. He'll listen to you, he said. So I had to swallow my pride and go out there and say in a gentle tone, look, Ace, whatever else is going on in your life, you owe it to your fans to show them that you can still be a great guitar god. This appealed to him, and he came back and started rehearsing. It didn't stop him from showing up late at other times, though. At around this time, I wanted a band biography to be written for the reunion tour, and I wanted someone famous to do it. I tried to get Stephen King, but he was unavailable. Then I tried Steven Spielberg, but he was also unavailable. Then I thought about Bob Guccione, the editor of Spin. At that point, Spin was every bit as big as Rolling Stone. So even though we had once sued Guccione for printing and distributing an illegal and unauthorized KISS magazine in the 1970s, he took my call, and we chatted. He agreed to write the bio, which would be a short thing, like a press release. Along the way, I told Guccione about our reunion tour and the fact that we were getting back together. I wanted him to put us on the cover of Spin. He thought it was a good idea, although he wasn't sure it should be the whole band. He wanted a cover picture of me, alone. While talking to him, I saw a larger opportunity, and the idea just started flying out of my mouth. I ended up pitching him on a collector's edition set of 4 identical KISS covers, one for each of us. The KISS fans will want to buy all 4 of them, I said. When the 4 solo covers of Spin came out, I brought them into rehearsals at Cobo Hall in Detroit before our first performance to show Ace and Peter that I was pushing the band, not myself. As long as I live, I'll never forget Ace's reaction. He picked up his solo cover and said, "I fucking hate this. This sucks. I'm leaving the band." And he walked out. He later came back calmer and explained that he didn't like his photograph. By the end of the day, he was looking around and asking us if we really thought his picture looked okay. Subsequently, I learned that Guccione had printed 60% Gene Simmons covers, and 25% Paul Stanley covers, the remaining 15% was divided between Ace and Peter covers. It was not the equal printing everyone thought it was. The first leg of our reunion tour lasted 193 shows and ran over 2 years. It was a triumph in every way. At the end of 1997, we were playing in New Jersey, and Dick Clark, ever the gentleman, asked us if we would ring in the new year. We had become the #1 touring band. Number 2 was our good friend Garth Brooks. The reaction was so tremendous that for the Millennium New Year's Eve, Dick Clark decided to rebroadcast the footage. For all the wonderful feeling that passed between the band and the fans, the old problems were cropping up again. You think people will change. You hope they will change. You expect them to mature, to learn from their mistakes. But they don't. Ace would constantly ask questions about the number of people showing up at the concerts. These would be concerts in places we had played before, and the halls and stadiums hadn't changed in size. But he wanted to know whether anybody was hiding any tickets. Astonishingly, Ace was oblivious to the fact that he had a flat deal. If nobody showed up, or if it sold out, he still got the same amount of money for each show he played. If he didn't play, he didn't get paid. I kept repeating that to him every time he asked. I didn't understand why he was agonizing over it. Then I found out that he wasn't just asking me. He would ask Doc, our manager, how many people showed up tonight? And Doc would say, oh, I don't know, maybe 15,000 people. Then Ace would produce a piece of paper from the concert hall, a schematic that showed the seating arrangements. On the bottom, it would say, capacity, 19,000. And he would bring me the paper and shake his head and say, see, more lies. Keep in mind it said capacity. But it was just like Ace to ignore that, or not to know what capacity meant. It seemed as if he didn't understand the difference between capacity and attendance, or that because our stage show was so big, we had to kill 3,000 or 4,000 seats. Peter, for his part, retained a frustrating inability to understand press coverage. Articles would appear about the band, and Peter would be furious at me. He'd come up and confront me and say, "What the fuck did you say about me here?" I would take a look, thinking that maybe I had been misquoted. I hadn't. Before the interview, the reporter had written his introduction, and maybe he would mention that Peter had known drug problems or had been bankrupt. This was the writer's voice, not mine, but to Peter it was the same thing. Now that the band had reunited and I was spending more time with Peter and Ace, I was starting to see the effect 20 years of heavy drug and alcohol use had had. Ace had lost much of his memory. He has been quoted in magazines and has said directly to me that he literally doesn't remember entire decades of his life. I would like to think of that as a rock and roll exaggeration, but I have seen much evidence of memory loss. For example, Ace would come up and tell me a joke, and then come by a little later and try to tell me the same joke again, but not remember how it went. Peter also suffered from memory loss, but the difference between the two has been striking. There would often be moments of clarity on Peter's part when we were on tour. He would tell me how he had gone wrong, and that this would be the first day of the rest of his life. He was tired of fighting his demons. He was tired of trying to show the world that he was a badass. He had been through 2 divorces that broke him spiritually and financially. He would speak very openly about wanting to change, and for some of the tour it was fun being around him. He would aid us in trying to keep Ace on the straight and narrow, saying things to Ace like, "You're a father. What's your daughter going to say? I've been through the same stuff you've been through. It doesn't work. I don't want to go back to playing clubs, do you? It's time to straighten up." Unfortunately, it didn't work. Later on, when Peter's insecurities kicked in and he saw that he had made millions of dollars from just one tour, he started to wonder why he hadn't made more, despite the fact that the contract he signed outlined exactly what, when, and how everyone was to be paid. When he got like that, he would team up with Ace, and he'd be back to the Peter who had tortured me from the beginning. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when this happened. Peter was just too unpredictable. I had witnessed his unpredictability firsthand throughout our years together. For example, Peter once shot my television set. While he was trying to separate from his first wife, I let him use my apartment so he could hide out with his Playmate of the Month, whom he seemed crazy about. I gave him the key and the run of the house. When I came back, I noticed that my 6-foot television screen seemed bigger and newer. It was. It was now a 7-foot television screen. When I looked behind the screen, I saw that part of the wall had been repainted. I found out that Peter and this woman, who had become his second wife, had been watching TV. Peter, for some reason, had his .357 revolver out. When an actor's face appeared on the screen and he heard his girlfriend had known the actor, he shot the screen. It wasn't the first time he'd done something stupid with a gun. When the band was on hiatus over the holidays, during Peter's first marriage, he shot the tree out from under his first wife as she decorated it. Ace and Peter may have tended toward this kind of behavior, but their weaknesses were exacerbated by their management. Both of them were still managed by George Suett, and he was, more and more in my opinion, acting the role of the band's management. I had in no uncertain terms told him not to do this. When we were playing the MTV Music Awards at the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, I saw George giving directions to some New York policemen. I went over to him and said, "George, stop it." Unfortunately, I think he was under the direction of Ace, who kept telling him to do whatever he could to promote him rather than the band. At the end of the day, Suett almost got Ace and Peter into a nightmarish financial situation. I urged Ace to get some help. Although I'm not a financial advisor, in my opinion, it looked like a sinkhole and would leave Ace holding the bag. When he did get some outside advice, they told him that it was the worst deal they'd ever seen. Ace and Peter parted company with Suett, and they soon sued each other. There are still claims pending. After the split with George Suett, Ace and Peter started to separate. Peter, because he straightened up a bit, would often see how Ace showed up late or didn't show up at all. He would sometimes turn to me and say, "Don't get angry with him, he's bombed." Other times he would turn to Ace in a meeting and say, "You can't bullshit a bullshitter. You're high. I can see it in you." A number of times I was surprised by Peter's honesty and clarity. As Ace lost Peter as his buddy, he withdrew. Despite Peter's drug past, when he did come back to the band after '96, he was for the most part straight. He showed up and tried to do his work, although his attitude was always that of a complainer. In time, Kiss was called upon to deliver another album to the record company. When I say Kiss, I mean Paul and me. We were the only real members of the band. Ace and Peter were not signatories to the contract. Bob Ezrin, who'd been with us before in Good Times, Destroyer, and Bad, The Elder, started working on a new album, which we called Psycho Circus. But after a while, it became obvious to us, and to Bob himself, that he was too busy with his internet company. During the initial rehearsals, he didn't think his contributions were as good as they should have been, and he took himself out of the picture. Then Bruce Fairbairn, a producer who had been successful with bands like Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, and Loverboy, among others, came to meet with us in Winnipeg, Canada. We explained to him that it was going to be a nightmare. Needless to say, from the beginning to the end, he was tortured by Ace and Peter, who tried yet again to change the contract and didn't show up for most of the record. We had to use Tommy Thayer, Bruce Kulick, Kevin Valentine, and others in their place. Bruce got us through the process and helped us to make a good, solid Kiss record, one that debuted at #1 in many countries around the world. Unfortunately, within the year, Bruce Fairbairn was found dead in his house in Vancouver. That was the last Kiss studio album, and it may be the last one ever. We have enough unreleased material to keep fans satisfied for quite some time, in the form of rarities, demos, and so forth. but it would take an earth-shaking event to get us back into the studio. In the current market, there's no real place for a new Kiss album, and I'm not interested in making an album that doesn't succeed. During that Psycho Circus period, I had another once-in-a-lifetime experience when I hooked up with Bob Dylan and ended up co-writing a song with him. We weren't put together by anyone else. I just looked up Dylan's number, called his manager, and said that I had long been an admirer. I had never spoken to Dylan, never met him. He came to my guest house in Beverly Hills, and the whole experience was very cordial. I spent about 2 minutes telling him how important he was to music in general, and to me personally. He's a very easygoing guy, but he doesn't say much. Then we sat down, picked up acoustic guitars, and traded licks back and forth. He had something I liked, I had something he liked, and so on. When we recorded the song, he was nice enough to come down to the demo studio. Since then, I've been begging him to write the lyric. He keeps telling me that I should do it. Can you imagine that? Bob Dylan is telling me to write lyrics. The 1998 Psycho Circus tour kicked off at Dodger Stadium, the first 3D tour in history. You got your ticket, and you got your glasses, which at various points in the show would make it seem three-dimensional off the screen at the back of the stage. Between concerts, we flew on our own Gulfstream jet with all the amenities. We stayed in the best hotels, and when we had a day off in Texas, Ace decided to visit his Texas cousins. They actually resembled him, but spoke with drawls like the Beverly Hillbillies. They were nice enough and said that Ace would stay with them on their farm. I imagined Ace on horseback, but I didn't want to think too much about it. Later I heard Ace was in the hospital, and word got out that he had shot himself. It seemed Ace decided to go shooting with an Uzi, an Israeli machine gun designed to shoot hundreds of rounds per second. There was a time when it was the fastest and deadliest weapon of its kind. Apparently, from Ace's explanation, one of the bullets backfired and a piece of shrapnel lodged in his chest. When he felt better, I asked him why he went shooting with a machine gun in the first place, and he actually responded in so many words. "Yeah, well, if you Israelis knew how to build a machine gun, this never would have happened to me." Ace generally needed diversions. He had flown in a bodyguard to keep him company. Ace's reasons for companionship, be it girlfriend or bodyguard, were usually to get him ice for his drinks, pack his bags, or be his playmate when he was in the mood to cause mischief. While we were at the same hotel where he had the machine gun incident, he bought paintball guns, and he and his bodyguard shot at each other inside the hotel suite. Afterward, we found out that the suite was a complete disaster. The walls and furniture were covered with paint. A blanket had apparently been dropped in a bathtub full of water, for God knows what purpose. The hotel banned Kiss from all Four Seasons hotels nationwide. It took some doing to explain to the hotel that only one of us had the mental capacity to actually conceive of having a paintball fight indoors, and that the person would be most happy to pay for the damages. The hotel quickly gave Ace a bill of approximately $10,000. He countered by saying he would sue them for any number of reasons. This was classic Ace. Everyone was trying to get him. He was the innocent victim. This feeling of persecution depressed him. He couldn't understand why his domestic life seemed to be in such turmoil. He couldn't understand why the government was after him for unpaid taxes. He couldn't understand why Canada always made him go through such a ritual before they let him into the country. The fact that the rest of the group had to wait around for hours while we pleaded with the Canadian government that Ace's drug busts were a thing of the past was completely lost on him. Ace always blames the government or fate or anything or anyone but himself when things go wrong. We were touring the world but not having a good time doing it. The chemicals had started to handicap Ace even more, and he had a girlfriend who seemed to tolerate willingly this lifestyle. Peter, too, succumbed to his inner demons. He went back to being the moaner, the nickname given to him by a former road manager. We still had a few tricks up our sleeves, though, or at least I did. I called Hugh Hefner, who's a friend of mine, and told him I was in discussions with Penthouse for a Kiss cover and that I wanted to let him know about it because we were close to a deal. He told me to forget Penthouse, and he would put the group on the cover of Playboy, if we had an angle. I suggested the girls of Kiss. The photos and article would be about the female Kiss fans who delighted in going to our shows, showing us their breasts, and throwing their undies and bras on stage. He loved it. Under the wonderful guidance of Marilyn Grabowski, the word went out, and about 30 girls came, undressed, and put on their Kiss makeup. We had the kind of photo session guys can only dream of. When Playboy appeared on the stands in March 1999, I was on the cover alone with 4 girls. The band, especially Ace and Peter, believed it was another one of my schemes. They had expected and demanded to be on the cover. When Playboy was about to come out, Kiss had the coveted spot on the Super Bowl telecast, seen around the world by 1 billion people. 550 girls in Kiss makeup joined us as we lip-synced Rock and Roll All Night. Our fireworks and rockets were ultra-charged, since the sky was the limit, and we showed the Super Bowl and the world how it should be done. We were the openers. After Kiss, Cher sang the national anthem. We saw each other later that night and reminisced about the great times we had had. She had just come off the biggest single of her career and was feeling great. While we were at the Super Bowl, I arranged to meet with Linda and Vince McMahon, the owners and creators of the World Wrestling Federation. I pitched them the idea of a Kiss wrestler called The Demon. I've been to hell and back. I told him that we could follow it up with the Star Child, who was too pretty for his own good, but could kick butt, and so on. Then we could introduce female versions of Kiss, Lady Demon, Wild Child, and so on, and then Kiss Kids. While I was negotiating the licensing and merchandising slices we wanted on the back end, I was also talking to World Championship Wrestling, the rival wrestling outfit. In the end, I took the better of the 2 deals and went with WCW. It was a win-win situation for us, because Kiss retained all licensing and merchandising rights. WCW did all the work, and we reaped all the rewards. The debut event for The Demon came as we were at our wits' end by the end of our tour and were about to call it quits. We flew to Las Vegas to play one song, God of Thunder, at the MGM Grand for the debut, and made an enormous amount of money. It seemed like it should have been the easiest thing in the world, but with Ace and Peter, nothing was easy. The misery of it was like pulling teeth. Paul and I talked and finally decided to go out and do one more tour and then call it a day. This wasn't such a crazy thought. The comeback, which began in '96, was always a 5-year plan, emotionally for me and Paul, and by contrast for Ace and Peter. By the end of 1999, it was becoming very clear that physically neither Ace nor Peter could endure too much more, and Paul and I didn't know how much more of them we could stand. We really didn't have much more to prove either. By 1999, Kiss had scaled the heights. We'd been on the cover of Forbes magazine, had broken every box office record, and stood proudly right behind the Beatles in the number of gold record awards by a group. We had gotten our own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. We were wax figures in the Hollywood Wax Museum. We had done what we had always dreamed of doing. And although I had been very frugal all my life, I was now for the first time loosening the purse strings. Times had certainly changed. I had bought a car. I had bought property. I had cautiously dug my roots into the ground. I had 2 gorgeous kids who looked up to me. I was living with a living doll. But one thing hadn't changed. I still wasn't married. I had taken flack for that from friends, usually women, but it was the only way I knew to feel safe. I didn't want to fall into the trap of simply living my life by society's or anyone else's rules. As I said earlier, I really wanted my kids to have both of their parents' names. I did not want Shannon to take on my last name. I find it insulting to women that they would agree to throw away their last names and assume their husbands, like property. This is my car, this is my wife. I wanted none of that. I wanted Shannon to be her own person, decide her own destiny, and go after every woman desire she ever had, without having to check with the man. As much as I was trying to fight the conventional nuclear family, here I was, crazy about the mother of my kids. As of this writing, we've been together for 18 years. We have yet to raise a hand or our voices to each other. We often wonder if there's something wrong with us. We never fight about anything. So I let my guard down further and dug my roots deeper. I decided to build a 16,500 square foot home with enough room for everyone and my work. It would have 4 levels on 2 acres with trees, a tennis court, and a waterfall. Building it would take 3 years. In the meantime, we had a farewell tour to complete. The farewell tour kicked off in Phoenix, Arizona on March 11th, 2000. The stage set was a bigger, bolder version of the reunion tour, with 3 huge screens and 2 huge Kiss logos. It was an over-the-top version of what we'd been doing for 25 years. We opened with a film about the band, then moved right into Shout It Out Loud. The set was a strong mix of greatest hits and new material, the songs fans wanted to hear. I am not sure if anyone believed that it was really a farewell tour. People were crying in the audience. But maybe it wasn't because they were never going to see us again. Maybe it was because Ace and Peter were playing so badly. As the tour went on, it became clear to me that the decision to make this tour the last one was not only smart, but maybe inevitable. Musically, it was the worst we had ever been, but the amount of fan worship was tremendous. Many of the fans were celebrities. Russell Crowe came out to Austin, Texas. LL Cool J flew out to see us. The farewell tour also found Kiss solidifying its marketing deals. In fact, we took the opportunity to push our corporate connections to a new level. To my mind, one of the most interesting things about the band was the fact that we were never afraid to admit that we were in the rock and roll business. From the beginning, from 1973, I was less interested in respect, which can be here today and gone tomorrow, than in brand. Did people have enough interest in what we did to go out there and buy something associated with us? From the beginning, Paul was always more interested in credibility. I knew that credibility was fleeting. You can argue from now until the end of time whether something or someone is respected, but one thing you can't argue with is sales. I think fans sometimes sided with Paul. Some of them perceived our obsession with marketing ourselves as characters to be sort of juvenile. Way before anyone else was doing this, we stuck questionnaires in our albums. We wanted to know where the fans lived and what magazines they read. If we were going to take out an ad in a magazine, we didn't want to take it out in the wrong one. One way to find out which magazines people read is to ask them. My awareness of these practices went back to my childhood, to my own days as a pop culture fanatic. Since I loved Superman, I would certainly watch the TV show and buy not only the comic book, but anything that Superman endorsed. The same held true for Disney. Disney is not just the theme park and cartoons. It is anything you can imagine, from pillows to pajamas to videos. Mickey Mouse started out as a cartoon, then became a part of America. Whether Mickey Mouse is respected or not is such a small issue. When you're too big to argue with, you can make your own rules. Is Elvis credible or not? Who cares? The question is moot. You may think Santa Claus doesn't have any credibility, but at a certain time of the year, he rules. That's what I wanted for Kiss, to make such a big impact that authenticity or credibility would be beside the point. At around this time, Pepsi approached us with an idea for a broad music-based TV marketing campaign. that would use artists from all different kinds of music, from country to rock and everything in between. The commercials would star Hallie Eisenberg, a child actress, and include a country segment where she sang with a country singer, a soul segment where she sang with Aretha Franklin, and so on. Pepsi approached us at the end of 1999 and at the beginning of the so-called farewell tour. While we were in Phoenix, we filmed it. Not only did VH1 come down and shoot the beginning of the farewell tour, but the day before, we spent about 10 hours on the same stage filming the commercial. They only showed it a few times, and then as a corporate decision, Pepsi started to show the country version of the commercial instead. The problem was that when the Pepsi people did a test with their own focus group, it was 90% for us and only 10% for country. So they came back and started to play the commercial again. At the same time, ABC decided to use Rock and Roll All Night as the theme music for its fall schedule. The Pepsi deal was only the most recent in a long line of corporate associations. The very first one was for a Kiss Honda bike, kind of a Japanese Harley-Davidson. Many corporations around the country were scared of an association with us. We had no illusions about our corporate identity. We're like any other corporation. Some rock bands are delusional. They say they're a people's band, but even they don't perform for free. Whether you have long hair or razor blades in your eyeballs, you're a corporation. Kiss broke all the rules and ended up on the cover of Playboy and Fortune. We've never made any bones about the fact that the American dream is about not only fame, but also riches. Money does not make you a happier person. It's not everything. But it's better to have more money than less. Americans, by and large, feel a little awkward talking about money or showing it off when they have it. That's why the richest men in the country walk around in jeans. When a band that has sold millions of records walks on stage in jeans, it's every bit as much a costume as Kiss costumes. Each outfit is carefully designed to elicit a certain reaction. I'm here to tell you it's all good. We don't hide behind that mask. We worked hard. Bands have come out and said that we're corporate while they have integrity and they can point fingers, but the IRS makes no distinction. When you make money, it's called earned income. As a rock band, you are a business, and you have to seize every opportunity to promote your product. In the winter of 2001, as we were getting ready to embark on the Japanese and Australian leg of our farewell tour, Peter demanded a new deal. But we had a contract with him and weren't willing to meet these new demands. Peter held his ground and told us that we could take it or leave it. We left it. At the end of the day, Peter Criss is still the very same guy who, even before our first show at the Diplomat Hotel in 1973, a show where we scratched and clawed to get people there, was ready to quit the band. Why? Because he was disappointed that his best friend Jerry Nolan had a record contract. In 1980, our first Australian tour, we played to stadiums full of people. Peter missed that tour. And here we were, going back to Japan and Australia in March 2001, kicking off at Tokyo Stadium, and Peter would miss that tour as well. Eric Singer rejoined Kiss in the Catman makeup. Amazingly, during this final tour, I witnessed at least one miracle. An amazing change in the behavior of Ace Frehley. Maybe it's because he had a new girlfriend who seemed wonderful. Maybe it's because he was finally growing up a bit. Whatever the reason, I'd never seen Ace more responsible. He showed up on time, played his instrument, and helped out. Perhaps it was because Peter was not there and Eric Singer, the sweetest guy in the world, was. The company you keep matters. But through Japan and Australia, Ace was a joy to work with. With all this drama, with all the personal struggle and complicated feelings, the farewell tour ended up being the #1 tour in the world, based on calendar years. We started in March, but we were consistently selling out huge venues. It's comforting to know that you can end up on top, even after almost 3 decades. I feel a sense of accomplishment from our merchandising deals. I feel a sense of accomplishment seeing fans around the world putting on makeup that imitates what we invented almost 30 years ago. But in the end, the most satisfying part is still getting up on a stage and playing Kiss songs that fans have come to love, from Strutter to Deuce to Rock and Roll All Night. Soon, Kiss will hang up its boots and its studded codpieces. We'll take off our makeup, and when we walk off that stage for the final time, it will be bittersweet. To be honest, there are some things I won't miss. The reunion tour brought us back to square one, both in rediscovering the simple pleasure of playing in a band and also in putting up with the headaches of band members who didn't see us as a unit. I firmly believe that people have the right to behave as they wish. I have never thought I was anyone's guardian or protector, but for decades, I saw substance abuse problems intensify every insecurity, spark unreasonable anger, and fog Ace's and Peter's ability to make intelligent decisions. As the farewell tour winds down, it's clear to me that Kiss will never realize its full potential, because while the band was originally conceived as a four-wheel drive vehicle, we often had to drive on flat tires. On the other hand, we've also gone where no band has gone before. We've survived the punk movement, the new romantic movement, the thrash movement. We've survived every movement you can think of. We walked weird, we talked weird. We certainly looked weird. And what genre we came from is anybody's guess. We owe our allegiance to the spirit of early rock and roll. The point was uplift. We wanted to capture the spirit and energy of bands we had never seen on stage. We wanted to go where no band had gone before. We wanted our fans to be proud of us and leave our concerts with big grins on their faces. We wanted to stand guilty as charged by the poor deluded critics who thought they were insulting us by charging that we made complete spectacles out of ourselves. You're damn right we did. We wanted, finally and most important, to let our fans, the Kiss Army, know that they were the only reason we were doing this, that when they came to see us live and heard our call to arms, you wanted the best, you got the best, the hottest band in the world, Kiss. They would know in their hearts we wouldn't let them down. Kiss will continue, maybe not in the way you expect, but it will live on. There will be a Kiss cartoon. There will be Kiss theme parks. There are already, as you listen to this, Kiss caskets. They say you can't take it with you. I say you can. My mother taught me to dream big. Reach for the sky, she would say. And to her, I owe everything. And to America, sweet America. Thank you for making a poor little immigrant boy's dreams come true.
Copyright 2002 New Millennium Audio, a division of New Millennium Entertainment, Incorporated. Produced by Deborah Raffin and Michael Wiener.